Hello, and I am delighted once again to be talking with Valentin Gerlier. Hi there, Valentin.
Hi, Mark. Nice to be with you
Well,
again.
yeah, we spoke a while back and ranged over various figures that we love: Plato, Shakespeare, Nicholas Accuser, William Blake. And I wondered whether today we might try and follow a thread that went into a theme more, and that is the theme of philosophy and poetry.
Hmm.
Philosophy and poetry. We've been in reading groups that have trying to, in a way, been bringing these things together. So trying to surface some of why poetry might be a valuable way of thinking about things that are often thought about in philosophical terms and so
Yeah,
on.
yeah.
Um, why that might matter now, how it's done, and so on. I could begin, an obvious place to begin when you're much informed by the Western tradition, which is thinking about Plato.
Hmm.
Much misunderstood, I think, about his relationship to poetry, because the sort of noddy fact about Plato is that he wanted to ban poets from his ideal city state in the Republic. But of course, the minute you actually read the Republic, you realize something far more subtle is going on. And I mean, to cut to the chase, I think what Plato felt and sensed was that a lot of the poetry of his day had was growing moribund in terms of what he felt poetry could actually deliver. And so, in these sort of thought experiments about how to recover the heart of human life, both in the individual soul and in the community, there's this moment where they say, we've got to ban the poets. But that's only really to clear the ground for a revived poetry. And of course, Plato is a great poet. So the irony is that he says these things with this very poetic voice.
Yes,
Um, and that can get a bit lost in translation,
yes.
especially when people read Plato in these very analytic kind of ways. But nonetheless, so what he does in a way is set an agenda for us, which is okay. So look, if poetry can transmit something to us when it understands its vocation, what is that about?
Hmm.
What does that actually bring to our awareness, or what does that invite us into? So
Yes.
maybe that's a sort of way of framing the question. But do you want to sort of offer a thought to get us going as well?
Yeah, you summarized it beautifully there. And I was thinking about, one of the things, as you quite rightly say, there's this lovely paradox that, Plato's works. Um, I think often, people just pull out little bits and pieces and make a kind of textbook Plato saying he believed this, he thought that, he didn't like this. But actually, that's doing a great disservice to a very complex kind of entangled literature, in which I think he's different modes of language are functioning together. I think there's poetry and philosophy, as you quite rightly say. And I feel that Plato is acutely aware of the question of what is it that a kind of symbolic mode of expression can disclose, and what is it that a conceptual mode of expression can kind of uncover, and that the philosophical consciousness exists within that paradox, so that you have to, on the one hand, there is a sort of a quest to uncover truth, or to um, respond to the call of truth. And so there's something about this kind of cutting through falsehoods, and articulating and going beyond falsehoods towards something that is calling you, that seems to be true. And so there's this kind of gradual uncovering of things. And I think concepts in Plato, and perhaps in reality, work in that way. They're sort of diamonds or subtle knives where you just kind of cut through the falsehood. But on the other hand, there's this mode um, of just reality disclosing itself, and us participating in that experience. And that's at the point at which conceptual language is not really so useful, and symbolic language or poetic language becomes much more revelatory. And so you get, I think in Plato, you've got, as we know, there's moments which are very mythological, moments which are also quite playful and comedic, and moments which are very kind of anchored in a serious conceptual discussion. And I feel that, there's something about the Platonic philosophy that works within this paradox, that we can never get at truth purely through philosophical or conceptual articulation, and we can never just simply bask in the truth in a kind of wonderful cloud of symbolism. There's got to be these two voice, the poetic and the philosophic, have to kind of work together in that sort of dynamic.
I agree, and we've both been thinking a lot about William Blake, and so his work Contrary comes to mind when we think about paradox, of course. And so it's sort of holding two poles of attention,
Yeah.
and if you get that tuned right, then a third thing is unveiled to you or is released.
Yes.
I think so. In Plato, I think this is another way of putting what you're saying about the conceptual and the symbolic is analogy, perhaps. It's an important word for Plato. I think it's always worth remembering that he didn't even have the word analytic.
No.
I think coined by Aristotle after him. So he was doing something other than what we would think now of in terms of analytic or a kind of logical unfolding.
Yes.
He was, I think, you're right. That's beautifully put. The conceptual. Sometimes I think of it as that the symbolic or the mythological or the poetic, it sort of presents a horizon to us, and there's an intuition or a felt sense of the reality that's being disclosed. But you're right. We then need the more conceptual to try and almost take a step towards that horizon.
Yeah.
It feels quite the combination of the two enables us not just to to be fair, just to give Aristotle a nice name check, he does make this remark about how philosophy begins in wonder and ends in wonder. It's often forgotten, the end bit. But I think the two wonders are kind of the same but kind of different. The end wonder is one that has become more nuanced, differentiated, appreciative, to think of your work too, more praiseworthy. Of this reality that's being disclosed. And so the conceptual in Plato, I think, is much more aimed in that direction, which is why, when philosophers these days, I remember this, you read a bit of Plato and you try and follow the argument, and you often kind of think it's not a very good argument. It's quite easy to pick holes in it when done in this rather narrow conceptual sense. But when it's about footholds and intimations and opening up and even offering back some sort of celebration of the symbolic disclosure, then it starts to make a lot more sense, I think. And it can be really rigorous, but it can be doing other things as well.
Exactly. And the rigor has to be, I think you're right about the wonder thing is so important, isn't it? Because the rigor has to be inspired by an initial sense of something which is beyond the narratives and the ideologies and the thoughts of today. You get a sense that, hang on a minute, I've seen something different. This isn't quite right. So the initial kind of wonder-filled experience, truth-filled experience, we might even say, kind of powers the kind of analytic rigor that comes afterwards, because there's a realization that the present conditions are not that. The insight has just given you a sense of something beyond the present conditions. And so I think the kind of rigorous or conceptual aspects of human thought come at the service of that initial insight. They don't come just for the pleasure of coming up with a logical, logically coherent statement. Those in Plato usually don't work anyway. But I think the moment that there is this initial insight, this initial kind of participatory experience, perhaps we can reach towards a Barfield there in a sense. But I think once there is that, then all the powers and the instruments of the mind come at the service of that. And I think that much of the philosophy in Plato moves towards that. And also, I would add that there's a sense in which Plato knew that, in a sense, the end of philosophy is not the conclusion at the end or the kind of proposition that we get to, but it is in the practice of the dialogue itself. that something comes to be present. And sometimes it occurs amidst the perplexity and amidst the kind of difficulty and the new questions that a particular pursuit of some theme or some topic or some idea has created. So in a way, the philosophical language is doing philosophy and not aiming at some kind of final truth that we can just finally arrive at and be happy forever. So it's this wonderful kind of unfolding dynamic, because philosophy is in time. It must continuously be repracticed in a way.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember that these days, in rather literal age that we live in, where there is a much more linear sense of truth that you can kind of get to it and then formulate it and then of course use it in some way.
Yes.
Whereas I think the poetic voice is much more about an incarnation or a manifestation of something that's beyond the words themselves, which is why the edge of words, to use Rowan Williams's expression, is so important. And to reference Barfield again, I love his idea that in the poetic voice, the words come together in a way that releases a soul and experience. A dissonance, often he says, is sometimes the most powerful poetic voice, because in that dissonance, something unexpected that you'd forgotten, and of
Yes.
course, remembering is a huge Platonic theme, and the poetic can bring that about. But it also reminds us that it is momentary, moment by moment, rather than once and for all, because of that ongoing revelation. The truth is transcendent to us, although I think closer to us than we are to ourselves as well.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
immanent. But that's why the poetic voice matters so much, because it holds us in that ever unfolding space, rather than, and in a way, now for nowadays in a literal age, you might say, kind of resists the more fundamentalist attitude that would assume it can be captured once and for all, and then the process of philosophy is just sort of transmission, really, in a rather flat sense, passing on the dogma or the doctrine, or in a more secular context, the settled findings of the philosophical community or something like that.
Yeah.
So we really need that sense of that spirit, because of the literalism that so abounds nowadays.
Absolutely. And I think the literalism is also a disservice to the genius of language itself. And here I'm going to speak perhaps more on behalf of the poets, and also remembering that from a Platonic point of view, logos and nous, or mind in a kind of cosmic sense, and language are related. There isn't this assumption that they're completely split, as we have in modernity or nowadays, as though language were this kind of tool that we use to describe a reality which is external to us. I think in the Platonic sense, there's much more of a trust in following, as Socrates puts it, following the logos wherever it leads. And I think that there's something to that in the poetic. If I think of my own poetic practices, my own poetic moods, I have great faith in language, in its power to disclose its own being and its own participation in reality, quite aside of my own, philosophical thought, be they ever so lofty. There's something about linguistically exploring and unfolding and listening and participating with language and letting it play itself out, as it were, which I think is what the poetic brings to the philosophic. Because I think philosophical thoughts can be they have a tendency to be quickly sucked back into familiar conflicts and conversations, and use technical terminology very quickly and say, well, I'm a this and I'm not a that. And so it becomes a kind of weird, esoteric, specialized discipline. And there's something about the poetic heart of language that really wants to leap out of that, and actually articulate and disclose things that are just not available to the discourse of philosophy. So that's why I gravitate, even though I have a philosophical nature, perhaps I gravitate towards poets, because I feel like poetic language discloses, and it has a particular mode of saying, disclosing, articulating, unfolding, which is primary, and which philosophical language afterwards gets inspired by, or kind of includes in its own discourse. But there's something primary then in that way, and unrestrained and endlessly creative, about philosophical language. And there's something about its indeterminacy, the fact that it's always flirting with the unknown. I think that, contrary to some postmodern philosophers who would say, haha, that's, there it is. You see, meaning is this kind of endless shifting and actually not really there. For me, the indeterminate aspect, and I think perhaps for Blake as well, is actually the sign of the divine presence in the logos, of the truth in the logos. So it's
I
actually,
completely agree. Yeah, I think that again, resisting that postmodern tendency to say, I don't know, poetic play, just the continual play of poetry, skating across the surface because the surface is all that there is. And it's just the momentum, the movement itself that matters. I think that misunderstands it in precisely the way you're saying, because it's more like a dance in partnership with that which is,
yes,
it is alive and felt and present, but
yes,
within the ineffable as well.
absolutely.
So and we're the human creature that's in that sort of in between zone. It's quite a Platonic idea too.
Yes.
It is our calling to both struggle and to celebrate with these things. And the way Plato would say, the way up and the way down are one and the same.
Exactly.
Be
Yeah.
another kind of metaphor. And I think you're right about I did this significance there of the poetic being primary. I mean, that is a really very profound and radical statement, I think, to say now, because I suppose this is an attitude I'd had, which is that the poetic is a kind of bit of color or bit of gloss or an aesthetic kind of coating to the hard truths which were discovered through other means. I mean, maybe the empirical as well as the philosophical. But actually, the great discoveries in, say, the scientific tradition, I think very often you'd find a poetic inspiration actually was prior. I mean, I've read that Einstein, for example, he would talk about in terms of the imagination, but he felt that the imagination was really, he talks about somewhere how imagination can go around the whole cosmos, and then it gives us little leads and threads that then the mathematical mind, for example, can bring into some sort of form. But the imagination there being prior, I guess he's in the tradition of more romantically influenced scientists. And it's a concern I've heard some scientists say about the turn to computers and algorithms in terms of the pursuit of knowledge, because it does lose contact with that poetic inspiration.
Yes.
Through the sort of sheer churning of data and so on. There's no insight in that. There can be results, but there's no insight.
Yes.
And I mean, there's a Michael Attilia, who was the president of the Royal Society. I remember a few years back he gave a talk where he talked about this being a Faustian pact, for which he literally meant you get power, but you lose insight, and so you become uncoupled. So it's both a radical statement, but also, again, one I think that really matters hugely,
Yes.
because it puts us back in touch with things
Yeah.
that are beyond us, and that's where life is found.
Yes, and I think particularly in this kind of age of where we so easily, the temperature so easily rises and rhetoric becomes so easily extreme. I think it's so important to keep on noticing that what drives our actions and our beliefs and our feelings are not cut and dry ideologies or kind of value systems that we like to think that we have, but deeper narratives which are much more complex and much more poetic. There's a sense. I think what I'm trying to get at here is that the poetic or the imaginative or the story-like is a more basic unit of human meaning, and part of the reason why it's basic is that it calls to all our faculties, the emotive ones, the sensitive ones, the appetitive ones, our bodies as well as our nervous system, as well as our mind, souls, and spirits are kind of called into question by the poetic. And therefore stories are so powerful, so fabulously powerful, and we exist within them, whether we like it or not. I mean, sometimes I notice my own students are very anxious to change the narrative. Like, how do we change the narrative? And I always feel like, well, if you're inside the story, you can't just step out and imagine yourself as the author. You have to realize that you're participating in a grand unfolding. That's step one. And bringing in kind of creative change is something that happens when we realize that there's a sort of mythical dimension or an imaginative dimension or a poetic dimension, which is really very strong. I'm thinking, for example, there's so many people that do great work in that field, and it's not just poets and mythographers, but a philosopher like Mary Midgley, she's written quite a lot about the myths that kind of power our current understanding of reality. She wrote about the selfish gene. She wrote a book called Science and Poetry, which really goes into that, and many others. And I think that kind of mythic understanding is not just at the service of a kind of fabulous ephemeral kind of search for wisdom, but it's also in really entering the everyday and understanding the deeper dimensions of the everyday. So in all these senses, I think this kind of renewed feel for poetry is ever so important. And as you quite rightly put it, it is the opposite to this kind of decorative flourish on an otherwise brute reality. It's actually the heart of reality as we experience it. So it's ever so important. Yeah.
I wonder just about one little example that comes to mind. I'm enough of a kind of rational person to like actual examples as well. And I mean, we mentioned earlier, I think I did, the relationship between the transcendent and the immanent. And I remember doing a bit of philosophy of religion at one point and trying to write a fairly analytical essay about how whether they were opposites in the sense of diametrically opposed, as opposed to contraries, sort of mutually indwelling, and trying to do it in rational terms. And it's really hard because the transcendent does, in analytical terms, seem to mean that which is wholly other, apart, different from, and so on. Whereas the immanent is that which is utterly present, close, the ground. But someone like William Blake, to quote a very, very famous phrase of William Blake's, can cut right through that debate in a poetic line. And the line that immediately comes to mind is, to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Immediately, the transcendent, the immanent, the world in a grain of sand, you know what he means. Yeah. And that discloses how these things are actually intimately related. Yes. And then you can do, your philosophy off the back of it. But I mean, it's always encouraging to me, actually. That's, I think, one of the best known phrases of Blake. I'm sure it is. It's still speaking to us. And so that poetic voice keeps calling to us, even in an age which otherwise seems not to quite know what to do with it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's so interesting. I mean, again, thinking very briefly about Mary Midgley in relation to that, I think she's very good at writing about how persistent the myth of atomization is in our society. So there's a story that somehow it's about getting to the building blocks of something. It's about getting to the irreducible but measurable entities that are at the bottom of what you're trying to get at. So really, it's about to see a grain of sand in a grain of sand, not to see a world in a grain of sand. And that myth kind of persists at so many levels, in such a way that, for example, when you're engaged in a discussion, people are often worried about what they call the takeaway. Right? So what you're saying, they'll ask you, what you're saying is X, your view is Y. There's a sense in which, like, I would like this in bullet point form so that I understand your fixed position. I can itemize your position. I can just understand the building blocks of your position. And what we're talking about, I think, has got this kind of presence of the transcendent in the immanent, in a way, admits of no position, because, as you said, it's also wholly apart and wholly different from and wholly other. And so, some people say, well, that's just vaporous. Like, you're talking about nothing. And instead, you are talking about something very specific, but also that cannot be made into an object. So I think this thing about to see a well in a grain of sand is really it's beautifully poetic, and that whole poem, by the way, is my life manifesto. But apart from that, it's also extraordinarily, as you say, it's extraordinarily philosophically rich. Um, so to recover that ability to see a well in a grain of sand, there's something um, really important to that, but also something that is saying to us, why aren't we seeing a world in a grain of sand? And then you enter the philosophical thing that we were describing before. You enter the falsehoods that are present day reality, in which there is this persisting sense that no, hang on a minute. At the end of the day, it's about units. It's about isolated selves in society. It's about selfish genes, whatever it is. But it's, and that's a kind of intuition that is itself mythic in the bad sense. It has no it has no definite foundations. It's just something that we believe it should be so. But to find out why we believe it should be so, then philosophical investigation becomes really useful.
So I'm wondering, I mean, that's a really good question. So why aren't we seeing a world in a grain of sand? And I guess it's partly because of what we think language is and can do, as you're saying, that not trusting it as the logos itself disclosing in words, but maybe regarding it more as like a tool to kind of, to probe and inquire. That might be one thought. But I'm wondering also, when you were talking there, my mind went back to what I've understood of the origins of modern science and what the hopes were for it were, which in a way were admirable. They were, I think, about trying to, I don't know, lessen suffering. Francis Bacon will write about how technology, science is given to us in order that we can restore a lost Eden, where human ills, will find some sort of solution or remedy. And perhaps that's another side to this poetic voice, which is that it's a voice also of falling and suffering and pain. And again, I think of Blake. I think one of the things you realize with Blake is that he's not actually a kind of ecstatic visionary who was wholly unconnected to everything else that was going on around him. It's precisely the opposite. He felt so keenly the suffering of his age and in himself, I think, and that was what inspired his poetic voice. He'll talk about Golgonooza, forever rising, forever falling, which is a bit like Plato's Republic. The city-states rise and they fall, and so that's a big question for civilization, I suppose. What's it orientated around? What's its mythos? Is it a kind of linear story of progress, I guess would be the modern world, where there's a gradual accumulation of knowledge that leads us into an ever more powerful, capable sort of future, and often guided by material well-being on a kind of incremental increase, or a sense of civilization as being to do with a continual unfolding manifestation of the one, from which all things spring. And I don't know, if you want a tangible expression of that, you go into a medieval Gothic cathedral. It's definitely an achievement of a civilization. You can't deny that in its brilliance, and its physical mystery. How on earth was this thing put together? It's still quite astonishing, and yet, of course, it's speaking of a greater mystery as well.
Yes.
And a society that is orientated around the production of that kind of expression. I don't want to get nostalgic, because I think that too is to lose touch with the ever-present origin. But nonetheless, the past can cast a light on the present, and particularly in a present that's mythos is we've got it. We're on the way, and I guess that poetic past can get us to ask that question again.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, I I like going to the pre-modern past in order to make the present strange, but not to condemn the present. And I think that there are some incredible potencies even now in our very confused moment. To me, it seems that the grain of sand thing, in a way, to come back to that just for a second, illustrates a larger kind of situation that really happened at the outset of modernity, and in a way permitted modern science to go into all the ways that it has, which is this um, uh, fracture between self, world, and the one or God, um, in such a way that it became possible to think of the human person as this kind of isolated, meaning-giving uh, arbiter of reality. So I think in our modern imaginary, this sense of primary, private kind of isolation, the meanness of things became so prevalent in our imaginary that it's almost second nature to assign to all other participants of the cosmos the same subjective oneness, the same isolated subjective oneness. And we can go into the reasons why uh, the kind of modern subject became the sole meaning giver, as opposed to God or nature being the meaning givers. But I think it's fairly historically and artistically substantiated that shift has happened in such a way that our imaginary really starts um, here outwards. Whereas I would surmise that a kind of more ancient way of looking at things, if I can make this huge generalization, is that because the cosmos is kind of saturated with intelligence, you're almost starting from the outside in. So there's been a real big shift there, and I think that the persistence of that imaginary is the reason why so many things appear confused. But at the same time, it is powering a quest for a sort of reunion or a recovering of participation. How do we understand the cosmos as related, all the beings, humans and non-humans, without collapsing everything into a gooey, undifferentiated oneness, so that where everything retains a kind of unique, to use a Blakean word, particularity, or a kind of unique dignity, but at the same time is deeply interrelated. So I think there's something in modernity that is that quest. It's just this quest for a new fold, a new kind of relationship. And somehow at this moment in time, maybe things like philosophy have become a bit sterile, and I would be trusting more a kind of poetic voice to bring us there. But I think that's really what's called for. And when you go into the Gothic crusade, I mean, I also am very sensitive to them, and I can feel this very strange kind of slightly evanescent sense that the imaginations that kind of brought that sort of work into being had a sense of the cosmos as a sort of textured whole, rather than a highly individualistic grain of sandish one. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that thinking about what intelligence actually is, in quite a philosophical way, is a way into a recovery of that medieval sense. Because intelligence wasn't something that maybe you possessed, I possessed if we're lucky, and could try and make something of it,
Yeah.
but rather is a participation in the wider intelligence that all things show and manifest. And so relating to non-human others is quite as important as relating to human others, because there's an intelligence there that maybe it is something distinctive about the human intelligence that can relate to other intelligences. Although, immediately one starts thinking of plants and funguses these days, and how there's all sorts of interrelating intelligences going on there. But I think there is I think things are changing, because I know I was recently reading a book by a science journalist, Philip Ball, called How Life Works. And what he's done is put together all that's been unfolding in the 40 or so years since The Selfish Gene came out. And what it needs is a mythos, I think, because part of the brilliance of that book was it had this very powerful story. And so we need to retell the story. But what Philip Ball is saying is actually a lot of the science of genetics and cells and ecological science and so on is showing that there is a cognitive element to all these levels of reality in life.
Yes.
And unless you take account of that, you actually, if you reduce it purely to the atomistic or the mechanical, you can't describe what you see before your eyes, in fact. Yeah. And so now this new generation of science is really beginning to come to grips with that and is venturing forth because it's quite taboo still in many ways. That's part of the, these reversals, the way they constrain. But nonetheless, maybe it does feel a bit at this 11th hour with everything that's going on in terms of the ecology too, of course, but nonetheless, that perhaps is part of the way down and the way up coming together. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, just, that you've said it so well. I think the challenge, I mean, I notice from what little I can gather, that now there's perhaps you're right that the myth of the kind of the isolated atom seems to have had its day, and more communities of understanding are noticing that. But there's also an overcorrection towards systems and networks, and the collapse of everything into this undifferentiated immanent oneness, so I think the great discovery of modernity is in a sense that there is something magnificent about and infinite about a one single unit, a one single grain of sand. There is something there. So the challenge will be to think together the complexity of the whole and the dignity and beauty of the singularity, and in such a way that they're together and apart at the same time. So in a way, it's the whole myth of the transcendent, not the whole myth, but the whole question of the transcendent and the immanent is going to pose itself in this way. And I think if we're talking about progress, I'm not really sure what that means, but I don't think we will go forward unless we stop cutting out bits of reality like the transcendent and pretending that it's not there. I think wherever, if we turn our head towards the modes of understanding that are, showing us things, whether it's in ecology or it's in poetry, I think they're both showing us the same thing, that the one and the many have to be thought together, that the transcendent and immanent have to be thought together, and that's a dynamic challenge. But I think that we're called to doing that.
Yeah, I do agree about wariness of systems. I mean, when you said that, it made me think that, again, language perhaps tells us that it's not quite right, even if the impulse is to be honored, because it falls over itself. You get these very clumsy neologisms often in this domain, post this, meta that, hyper something else, and there's something in that kind of language that for me makes me think, I understand what you're doing, but you're trying to grasp something rather than trying to relate to something. Whereas, I don't know, a book like Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, a book which Hooray has done and is doing really, really well. The poetic voice in the capable hands of the scientist, Merlin Sheldrake, starts to speak of a very different kind of world. And I hope very much that the spirit of that book is part of the reason why it's being so appealing to people, because that is the kind of intelligence that is not just, as it were, measuring and probing and prodding, but is walking and imbibing and dwelling in. So these things come together.
Absolutely. Yes. And in that way, I think it would be interesting to return to poetry, not just as a kind of way in which language expresses itself and in which we participate, but also to return to the question of poetry and philosophy in a way that poetic expression has different moods, doesn't it? I mean, to think about one of my other loves, which is Shakespeare, and even Blake himself. There's a very strong comedy tradition, as well as a strong tragedy tradition or irony tradition. And each of these modes of kind of poetic expression has its own specific insight into reality. And if you take a kind of comedic viewpoint, reality sort of unfolds thus. And if you take a tragic viewpoint, it unfolds thus. And an ironic unfolds thus. So it's quite interesting that these different and kind of long practice modes of poetic expression also have their own way of getting at reality. And they speak very differently, and those voices are irreducible. Again, I'm wary of the danger to sort of reduce everything to one mega theory, and just noticing that I think there's something in the poetic spirit that just refuses that. It's just, that reality is incorrigibly will go on being elusive, and therefore you need as many poetic forms as possible to kind of elucidate its various aspects. And great poets like Blake is often remembered as, well, at least for us both and perhaps for others, as sort of mystic poet, perhaps. Someone with the kind of a sense of the spiritual meaning of things, but at the same time he had a great sense of humor, and he wrote satirical works, and there is always a note, a kind of delightful sarcasm in everything he writes. So there's something about, I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. There's something about the forms that poetry has generated that are also, that give us their particular insights into reality. Even Socrates, a kind of comedic figure, isn't he? There's something about, I remember somebody recently saying, we have instances of Socrates laughing, but not so many instances of Christ laughing. These are different, they appear in different linguistic universes, and each has its own mode of revealing something about the meaning and presence of being.
Yeah, I do. I can see what you mean. And again, Shakespeare becomes this resource for us. I'm not an expert in the way that you are at all, but it's heartening when people keep returning to Shakespeare to try and find something. And just on Christ, actually, I mean, I think it's very much a sign of the way that modernity or post-Reformation has read religiosity. Actually, that Jesus is said never to have cracked a joke, because I think a lot of the parables and a lot of the sayings are bizarre and weird and strange. They've become rather flattened by familiarity, but camels going through eyes of needles, and leaving the 99 sheep going to search for the one that's got lost, and the trader that will sell everything to buy the pearl of great price. When you think about it, these are very strange comments. Actually, they're very weird, and I'm sure that weirdness, you mentioned weirdness, perhaps that is a good word to try and catalyze a new mythos for now. Is embedded in the New Testament, and maybe it's because it's been read in these sort of proof texting kind of ways that rather gets lost. The spirit of it gets lost. Blake's great on this. Blake says, that the Bible would not have lasted for 2,000 years or more if it was like a telephone directory, just a list of facts. Yes. The reason why it lasts is because it is this wellspring for the imagination and can go off in 1,000 directions. And that's not just an empty play. That is the very life of God. That's why a book like the Bible is inspired.
Yes, absolutely. That's really helpful what you're saying there. Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting.
I mean, perhaps beginning. So, do you want to pick something else up?
Carry on. No.
I mean, I was beginning to wonder about. I'm just drawing to a close, and stressing something that I know you've stressed. Because we both love him. We've mentioned Blake, and part of the brilliance of Blake is he does give us these wonderful couplets and quatrains that immediately awaken us to this horizon and what the symbolic and the poetic can reveal. But you said repeatedly trying to stick to the difficult side of his poetry as well, which is difficult in his, particularly in the epic poems, Milton and in Jerusalem. the emanation of the giant Albion and so on, because that is trusting the word to work on us rather than us being able to pin it down. And I think that I try to do the same with Dante. Actually, I think there's a lot in Dante that's like this, that you do need a way in, and that it can be very helpful to have someone who can help you provide a way in. But it is only a way in. It's not a final decoding or systematizing of these figures. It is to reach a point where you can have then an ongoing relationship with these texts, and that's really what you want. You want an ongoing relationship with them, not to have sort of done Blake or done Shakespeare or done Dante. Luckily people wouldn't say that about Shakespeare. Actually, he's a very remarkable figure in our culture in that way, isn't he? He is one that people return to. They would talk about reinterpreting, I guess. But nonetheless, the difficulty of poetry, that's its challenge. I mean, people will think that science can be difficult, and that's true. But there's a real difficulty with poetry as well, which is to be invited in this.
Absolutely. No, I thank you for bringing that up. I think that's right. And good difficult poetry does, such as Blake's, I think is it is work in the sense that we're not invited to admire from the outside as though it was a sort of finished canvas and here's my genius and enjoy my turns of phrase. It's more of a it is something that it's some strange alchemical process that is working within us in order to bring about something of a living energy. So the fact that Blake is so dense and moves so quickly between different vistas and constantly seems to invite us to stop and attend to what he's saying, I think there is a strong implicit sense in Blake. I don't know if he ever articulated that, but to me it seems so clear that he assumes that poetry is kind of massaging the soul in that way and just inviting the soul to wake up to this kind of elusive but so present energy that he's invoking. So in the very fact of staying with the text and letting the text, really meditating with the text and just resisting the urge to to block a meaning and to just keeping it open and keeping staying in a state of generous attention for as long as possible, then the meaning can come into being by itself. So there's a sense in which I think Blake is assuming that we will do the work with him. And ultimately, it's not about Blake, it's about us, because he has left a trace of something that can be revitalized in a totally different way because we live in a different context and have different questions. But I think that's the power of that text, that it completely transcends. It is deeply embedded in a context, but it also completely transcends it. And so I think reading good poetry is good work for the soul ultimately.
Yeah, his great task, I think, is his expression, which was partly his work, and that's why I think he can say the seemingly contradictory things, that he at once hears the divine savior speaking these words, for example, or a fairy, in the case of other poems, speaking these words to him, and that's part of his wit. But nonetheless, he must wrestle and work out the form, he'll say as well. It's both and. That's what an inspired text really is. It's not just automatic writing. It is receiving a revelation and then doing the work to try and connect that within oneself. But then, the really great works, as you say, then invite us to share in that connecting as well, not just admire them from afar. I think that's a really good spirit on which to draw to a close, if that's a good moment, because this is a challenge. It's not just a kind of aesthetic basking. You said right at the beginning, reality does not just invite us to lie down and soak in its warmth, but to step into it and to make something of it, perhaps particularly for we humans, but maybe for all living forms as well. And so, that sense of challenge is part of the invitation. It's got to be.
Absolutely. Well said. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you again. Thanks.
Great pleasure. Lovely speaking to you.